Hey everyone, I just spent the last couple of months reading through the Expanse series by James S. A. Corey, and I thought I'd collect every review into one handy video. But since I don't like recycling content outright, I thought I'd go ahead and review all the short stories as well as the comics too. The ones that aren't direct adaptations of the books anyway. The reviews are going to be in chronological order, and there will be a full ranking at the end of the video. Let's go. Hey everyone, I just read Drive, the first story collected in Memories Legion, and it was good. Unfortunate about the main character's name, but here we are. It's a short story about the life of Martian inventor Solomon Epstein, whose Epstein drive revolutionizes space travel and allows the series to begin. The pros? I liked the way the story wove Solomon's life and his final moments together. The transitions were very smooth, it wasn't jarring at all. I also really enjoyed how the story treated the physical effects of going too fast with the respect and realism that it deserves. And I enjoyed how the ending of the story looked beyond the scope of Solomon's life and gave a glimpse at the impact he had, despite him not being alive to see it come to fruition. The cons? Because this is just a glimpse at the life of Solomon and his wife, it's pretty surface level, but this is just a nitpick. The way the main books handwave how the Epstein drive works is fine, since it's not important, but it's odd that Solomon himself doesn't comment on how it functions, impossible as it would be to actually describe. And there isn't much difference between the Mars of the main series and the Mars presented in this story, despite the lack of the Epstein drive here, and it would have been interesting to see a bit more of a distinction between the two in the short glimpse we get of it. Overall though, this is a good story about an interesting part of the lore, a small moment that leads to great change, and I'd recommend it if you're a fan of the series and haven't checked it out yet, and I'm giving Drive a B. Hey everyone, I just read the Churn, the fourth story collected in Memories Legion, and man, that was bleak. It felt more like a gritty crime thriller than a science fiction story. It's a novella about a young man called Timmy growing up in Baltimore on an overpopulated Earth, and his job working for the dangerous mobster Burton. The pros? I enjoyed the omniscient perspective used in this story. It was a nice change of pace from the usual close third-person perspectives usually used in this series. This story was a fantastically unrepentant look at the darker side of the Earth of this setting. The situation is so depressingly believable that it could have been set in the present day, and none of it clashes with the few science fiction elements that are present. And Timmy is a tragic character, but he's also fascinating, and I like how at no point did the story pity him or judge him or glorify him. It presents Timmy and his world as is, and leaves the rest up to the reader. The cons? Much as I enjoyed the omniscient viewpoint, it was a little jarring at times when the subject of that viewpoint changed suddenly from one character to another. Like Hutch in Gods of Risk, Burton comes off as a bit of a stereotypical gangster without much depth to his character, but whatever, it's a nitpick. And for how dire a situation Timmy, Lydia and Eric find themselves in once the climax is over, it's all resolved rather abruptly, but once again, this is a nitpick. This was a hard read at times, but it was a good story and I really enjoyed it. It's pretty unlike a lot of the Expanse, but it does feel like it belongs, and it's a fascinating glimpse at what life is like for Earth's less fortunate in this setting. I'd definitely recommend it if you're a fan of the series, just don't go in expecting a focus on science fiction. And I'm giving the Churn an A. Hey everyone, I just read The Butcher of Anderson Station, the second story collected in Memories Legion, and it was okay. After how legendary the event is in the main books, I was kind of expecting more, honestly. It's a short story about the event that got Fred Johnson the nickname The Butcher of Anderson Station. The pros? Fred Johnson's response to the event felt very believable and human. He seems like a man tearing himself apart here, and I felt that. Similarly, the way Earth orchestrated the massacre on Anderson Station merely to send a message felt depressingly realistic. And it was interesting to see a bit of the setting prior to the start of the series. The cons? I don't think the framing device of Fred Johnson telling the story to Anderson Dawes during an interrogation was really necessary. I think the events and Johnson's personal response could have carried the story alone. Like I mentioned at the start of this review, I was kind of expecting a more detailed description of the event. The massacre is terrible as it is presented, but it doesn't communicate how it would give Johnson the nickname the Butcher of Anderson Station as well as it could. And this is kind of related to both points, but after what happened, it seems odd to me that Anderson Dawes or any belter would be so open to recruiting Fred Johnson so soon after the massacre, even after hearing his side of the story. It just felt too neat and clean. It didn't get the depth the situation needed, in my opinion. It's fine. I didn't hate it, but I don't think it was great either. Give it a read if you're a fan of the series, otherwise I think you can skip it. And I'm giving The Butcher of Anderson Station a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Expanse Origins Amos Burton, written by Georgia Lee, illustrated by Huang Dunlan, coloured by Juan Useche, lettered by Jim Campbell, cover designed by Scott Newman, with a story by James S. A. Corey, Hallie Lambert and Georgia Lee. And what the hell was even that? I guess they couldn't just adapt the Churn again, but what the hell did I just read? It's a comic about Amos Burton trapped in his past with his personal demons. I think. The pros? It was definitely unique, I'll give it that. The artwork was really nice as usual, and the fact that most of it was a nightmare mitigated the background problems I have with the other comics. And it was interesting to see Amos's life after the events of the Churn, but before he joined up with the Canterbury, even if it's probably non-canon in regards to the books. The cons? Interesting and unique as this story was, it didn't really feel like Amos. Some of it was close, but given his characterization in both the books and the TV show, it didn't really match what had come before. On that note, more than any of these comics, this one really didn't feel like it added anything to the series. Amos's past was sufficiently covered in the Churn, and this story is not the Churn. And good as the artwork is, there's just something about the way the illustrator draws the likeness of Amos as actor that makes every one of his expressions kind of silly. Not just in this comic, but Naomi's too, and it clashed with the tone sometimes for me. This comic is bonkers. I'd honestly suggest reading it for that alone, since it doesn't really add anything to the Expanse overall, but it was fine, and I'm giving the Expanse Origins Amos Burton a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Expanse Origins Naomi Nagata, written by Georgia Lee, illustrated by Huang Danlan, coloured by Triona Farrell, lettered by Jim Campbell, cover designed by Scott Newman, with a story by James S.A. Corey, Hallie Lambert and Georgia Lee, and it was pretty good. Is it just me, or does this panel look like it should be a meme, like Mum said it's my turn to use the Xbox? It's a comic about Naomi Nagata's early days on the Canterbury, and her first meeting with Amos Burton. The pros? It was nice to see the Canterbury again, along with Shed and Captain McDowell. They were all gone so quickly at the beginning of the books and the TV show that it was cool to give them a little extra attention. I really liked how this comic's focus was entirely on Naomi and Amos. It would have been so easy to force Holden and Alex into the story, but it showed restraint and I think it's better for it. And like with the other comics, the artwork is lovely. The cons? Like with the Holden comic, some of the backgrounds were very basic and it took me out of the story given how detailed all of the others are. Like with the other comics, this is obviously set in the TV show's timeline, but once again, this is a nitpick. And the climax where Naomi finds herself adrift in space after a repair job gone wrong felt like it was trying to echo events in Nemesis Games, but as it was, I just felt it was a little repetitive, like it was trying to capture the glory of that moment from the main books. Overall, this was another decent comic, but like with the others, you should only read it if you're ravenous for more, and I'm giving The Expanse Origins Naomi Nagata a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Expanse Origins James Holden, written by Hallie Lambert and Georgia Lee, illustrated by Huang Danlan, coloured by Triona Farrell, lettered by Jim Campbell, cover designed by Scott Newman, with a story by James S.A. Corey, and I really hope I pronounced all those names correctly, and if I didn't, I apologise. As for the comic, it was okay. It's a comic about James Holden's past in the United Nations Navy and the circumstances of his dismissal. The pros? More than anything, I enjoyed this comic because it didn't outstay its welcome. It did exactly what it set out to do without a wasted word or panel. It was very good in that regard. The artwork was very nice too. I think the illustrator did a good job of aging Stephen straight down to fit an earlier time frame. And I liked the framing device of the story being told from Holden's old commanding officer. She added a little extra bit of depth to the comic that I really enjoyed. The cons? Charming as this comic is, let's be honest, it didn't need to exist. There's very little depicted here that wasn't already made clear to the reader from Holden's own accounts of the events from the main books. Most of the time the backgrounds were very good, but there were usually one or two panels on every page where the backgrounds were just flat colours or straight up white voids, and it kind of took me out of the story sometimes. And the comic probably conforms closer to the TV show's timeline, but whatever, that's a nitpick. Overall it was fine, I enjoyed it. Give it a read if you're ravenous for more Expanse, but it's definitely not essential to the series, and I'm giving The Expanse Origins James Holden a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Expanse Origins Alex Kamal, written by Hallie Lambert, illustrated by Huang Danlan, coloured by Juan Useche, lettered by Jim Campbell, cover designed by Scott Newman, with a story by James S.A. Corey, Hallie Lambert and Georgia Lee, and it was melancholy, but it also wasn't book accurate, so into the bin it goes. It's a comic about Alex Kamal's attempt to make life on Mars work before taking to the skies again as the pilot he was always meant to be. The pros? It might not be book accurate, but it told a good story without lingering beyond its welcome. It really got across Alex's depression with mundane life. There was no attempt to sugarcoat or judge the situation, it just laid it out there. I really enjoyed the chance to see more of Mars, not just the planet itself, but its people too. The characters were great. I especially enjoyed Alex's sister. And the artwork was nice as usual. The cons? Like with all of these comics, some of the backgrounds were pretty basic and it took me out of the story sometimes. Because this comic does exist in the TV show's version of the universe and the characters have the likenesses of the actors, the whole thing left me a little sour given what came out regarding Alex's actor in recent years, but that's definitely a nitpick. And because this does very clearly take place in the TV show's timeline as far as the books are concerned, this comic is non-canon in a way the other comics were able to circumvent by being pretty vague about things, but once again this is a nitpick. In and of itself it's fine, I enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it if you want more Expanse if you can get past the likeness of the character, and I'm giving the Expanse Origins Alex Kamal a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Expanse Origins Josephus Miller, written by Hallie Lambert, illustrated by Huang Dunlan, coloured by Juan Useche, and lettered by Jim Campbell, and you don't know how upset I was to discover there was yet another Expanse story to read right at the last second. It was fine though. It's a comic about Detective Miller's life on Ceres as a Star Helix cop before the events of Leviathan Wakes. The pros? It was interesting to see more of the Ceres underworld within its own context, though sadly there were no cheese smugglers this time around. The artwork was great, as usual, and it did a good job of showing just why Miller is so jaded and depressed by the start of the series, both in the books and the TV show. The cons? Miller hooking up with Muss felt very out of character for both of them, at least if we're going by the books. I don't actually remember if they ever got together in the show, but it still felt very strange. Some of this comic moves away from Miller to explore the story of Jax the Orphan and his fellows, which felt very out of step with the series as a whole, given how tightly focused the points of view generally are across the board. And the simpleness of some of the background still irked me because otherwise they were the best of the lot of these comics. It was probably the nicest looking but least essential of all the comics. I'd only give it a read if you're a fan looking for more Expanse content, and I'm giving the Expanse Origins Josephus Miller a C. Hey everyone, I just read Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, and it was pretty good, but it's definitely not perfect. That aside, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't happy to read a science fiction story unrelated to Halo for a change. It's a book about Earth, Mars, and those living amongst the moons of the solar system's gas giants and the asteroid belt coming to the brink of all-out war after a mysterious spaceship destroys an ice hauler responding to a distress signal out in Saturn's rings, while a washed-out detective on Ceres gets dumped with solving the sudden disappearance of the daughter of a powerful Earther businessman. And I'm sure these things will turn out to be completely unrelated. The pros? The book does a great job of forming the suspension of disbelief by treating gravity and the sheer distance between everything in the solar system with relative realism. It makes the more outwardly science fiction aspects that crop up later on more easily acceptable. In this regard, the world building was very well done. The book spins a good yarn with the mystery of Julie Mao's disappearance and the destruction of the Canterbury that build to some spectacular twists and turns along the way, and I really liked the characters. They feel very believable and human, be they point of view or secondary characters. Holden and Miller, the main two viewpoint characters, especially read like two separate people with different drives and priorities, which makes sense given the book was written by two people, and it was interesting to see how they interpreted each other from their own perspectives. The cons? The pacing of this book is all over the place. Holden's first act journey is especially rocky with how many ships get blown out from under him in quick succession. The plot feels like it climaxes 3 times, it's just a clunky mess and it grated for me at points. The world building is pretty simple. There's Earth, which is old but has the most of everything. There's Mars, which is stronger but has fewer people. There's the Belt and the Outer Planets Alliance, who are the freedom fighter underdogs. And that's about it. There's nothing particularly wrong with this approach, and overall this is a nitpick given I know later books do add more depth to these factions, but I would have liked to have seen a bit more complexity here from the get-go. And this is another nitpick, but there's not really a central antagonist to focus on. There are villains running around being nefarious in the story, but most are impersonal or appear so little that they're not really present enough to give the protagonists an ongoing drive to stop them across the entire story. Something that only adds to the clunkiness of the pacing in my opinion. But again, I know this is something changed in later books. Overall, this book is a bit of a rocky start, probably due to the writers finding their footing with each other, but it's still pretty good, and I'd give it an easy recommend if you're a fan of science fiction because it is something different from your usual space opera. I know the TV show was very popular too, but I could never get into it because of how drawn out the pacing was and how forced the episodic character conflicts felt in the early seasons. But if you're a fan and you've never read the books, I'd suggest you give it a read if you haven't already. And I'm giving Leviathan Wakes a low A. Hey everyone, I just read The Last Flight of the Cassandra, a short story collected in the Expanse role-playing game rulebook, and it was actually pretty good. I don't really understand why it wasn't included in Memory's Legion. It's a short story about the crew of the Cassandra searching for pure water to make ends meet immediately after the destruction of the Canterbury, and the mysterious quarantined asteroid where they hope to find it. The pros? The crew of the Cassandra felt very Rocinante adjacent. It's easy to tell who each of the four are meant to represent from the main leads, but they put an interesting spin on the formula. I really enjoyed the mystery of the things the Cassandra finds on the quarantined asteroid. It was wonderfully macabre, and it was also nice to get a glimpse at something spooky that is unrelated to the proto-molecule in this setting for a change. And if this was written to be a jumping board for a tabletop campaign, then I think it fulfills that purpose very well. I'm sitting here right now thinking about how I would DM this story. The cons? I want to read the rest of this story. It was that compelling. It is wasted here in many ways. There isn't much depth here to the characters other than Darius, but that's probably so that players can make them into the people they want to roleplay as, so it's not a big deal. And it ended very abruptly, though that wasn't very surprising. Yeah, I enjoyed this one. I'd recommend it if you're a fan, and I'm giving The Last Flight of the Cassandra a B. Hey everyone, I just read Caliban's War by James S.A. Corey, and it was great. I don't want to waste most of this video going over the things it improved from Leviathan Wakes, but it basically did just address all my problems with that book and was better for it. It's a book about a crisis on Ganymede, the breadbasket of the outer solar system, that brings Earth and Mars to the brink of war, and the crew of the Rocinante once again stuck with the job of unravelling the truth of it all, while something alien asserts itself within the depths of Venus. The pros? The expanded roster of narrator characters was fantastic. Holden was a good anchor as a returning protagonist, even if he is insufferable sometimes. But Prax, Bobby, and especially Avasarala all brought new and interesting perspectives to the setting and the plot. They were great. I really loved the pacing of this book. The way it starts practically on opposite sides of the solar system and slowly draws together as the tension ratchets up for a big crazy action climax was a lot of fun. And the effort the authors put into making the crisis on Ganymede feel realistic and believable was great. I could easily imagine the sorts of things described in this book happening today, much less several hundred years in the future. The cons? There are a couple of times where things happen that feel like they were included only for the sake of keeping the plot moving, mainly Larson during the climax and the Pinkwater mercenaries earlier in the book. It's not that these things don't work, but they feel like obvious bandages plastered onto the plot without much thought, and they took me out of the story when they happened. In some ways this book just felt like a repeat, or at least an extension of Leviathan Wakes. Mainly in the way the plot is paced and the order of events. The inclusion of the Razorback after it's set up earlier, but also with the same people being responsible for the conflicts of both books. It's treated as a twist here, even though their involvement was made very obvious given the way one of the antagonists is characterised in the first volume. I don't know why they weren't instantly thrown into jail the second the truth came out in Wakes. I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels like they had an idea for one massive book, but couldn't make it work as a single volume, so they split the stories apart and aspects of both feel a bit wonky as a result. And this is mostly a nitpick, but I really didn't enjoy Holden as a character this time round. He's such a self-righteous idiot who is always jumping to conclusions without all the facts. But at least the book seems aware of that and has just about every other character call him out on it, so I can't be that mad. Overall, this book was great. There's a bit too much context required from Leviathan Wakes for me to recommend it on its own, but if you're interested in reading the series and you're a fan of science fiction, do it. There's probably something here for you to like. And I'm giving Caliban's War an easy A. Hey everyone, I just read Gods of Risk, the third story collected in Memories Legion, and it was good. I get the horrible feeling that this is what literary fiction is going to be like in 300 years. It's a novella about David Draper, Bobby Draper's nephew, a teenager trapped between college, the chaos of the times, and the seedy underbelly of Mars. The pros? David felt like a very authentic teenager. He was very well written. I enjoyed getting to see the events of this series from not only an outside perspective, but a civilian perspective, which contrasts well with Bobby, who is also a character in this story and was present for the big crazy moments in Caliban's War. And I really liked how mundane the plot is here. It's something that could very easily happen today on Earth, let alone in the future on Mars. And I enjoyed that aspect of the story not because it shows how human nature doesn't really change, but also because it offered a mundane contrast to the grand space opera aspects of the series. The cons? Ironically, the cons are all related to the pros, but David was such an authentic portrayal of a teenager that he was frustrating to be around at times, especially the way he stubbornly refused to accept help until the last moment. Because of the mundane nature of the story, it did feel a little unexciting at times. Like I mentioned, it felt more like a futuristic literary story, and I just don't enjoy that genre very much. And Hutch, while realistic I suppose, was a pretty stereotypical depiction of a skeezy drug dealer. Overall, this one was fine. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, but it's more Expanse, so if you're a fan, you should check it out if you haven't already. And I'm giving Gods of Risk a B. Oh, and side note, I agree with the authors that it should have been named Chemistry. That is a much more striking and appropriate title than Gods of Risk. But whatever, that's beside the point, let's move on. Hey everyone, I just read Abaddon's Gate by James S.A. Corey, and please tell me Andrew Smoot is named after a real person. I need someone in the world with that name. It's a book about a mysterious ring of alien origin that has appeared at the edges of the solar system, and the fleet of Earth, Mars, and outer planets ships sent to investigate what lies beyond. The pros? Ashford was a fantastic antagonist, not only because he was much more personal an enemy compared to the corporate executives and government officials of the previous books, but because he felt so believably human. Getting a peek behind the curtain regarding the mystery of the proto-molecule's origins and the whole can of resulting questions that opens up was really cool. It really put into perspective how small humanity is in this setting. And the conflict and climactic battle aboard the Behemoth was the best in the series so far in my opinion. One of the drawbacks of treating distance in space realistically is that everything takes a long time, but here that wasn't a problem thanks to most of the book taking place aboard one vessel. The cons? This book takes a while to really get going. It didn't hook me like the opening chapters of the previous entries did. It takes about 150 pages for things to really take off, and while it did pay off in the end, it did come off as a bit slow. The crew of the Rocinante really didn't have much to do in this book. Holden does a little bit in the second act and they all take part in the climax, but for the most part they're pretty passive in this one. It felt more like they were all here because they're the only constant characters across the entire series than because the story actually needed them for more than Melba's plot and one or two other chapters. And speaking of Melba, the new narrator characters, Bull, Melba, and Anna, while pretty good, just weren't as immediately engaging as Miller or Bobby or Avasarala from the previous books. But whatever, that's a nitpick. This one started off slow, but once it got going it was great, which is ironic given most of the book is set in a place called the Slow Zone. As with Caliban's War, I can't really recommend it on its own, but if you give the series a go, I'd suggest you stick with it as far as this entry if you're on the fence about it, because this book does show off the author's range. And I'm giving Abaddon's Gate an A. It might even have been an S if the first act hadn't been so slow. Hey everyone, I just read The Vital Abyss, the 5th story collected in Memories Legion, and this short could have been an email. It's a short story about Paolo Cortazar, one of the protogen scientists who worked on the proto-molecule after his capture by the OPA, as he ruminates on his life. The pros? As usual, the character work is great. I love how Cortazar simply can't make the connection between his mother's illness and his own situation. It would be tragic if he weren't such an evil person. The series only started introducing antagonistic points of view after the halfway point, so it was nice to go back and get an inside look at the events of Leviathan Wakes from the perspective of one of the villains. And it was neat to get a look at what actually happened to the scientists after their capture in Leviathan Wakes, since they just sort of disappear after the plot of Book 1 until Cortazar suddenly lurches back into the series at the very end of Book 5. The cons? This story doesn't really add anything to the series. I don't feel like I've gained a deeper understanding or appreciation for the Expanse through having read it. It just feels like it's here for the sake of being here. Though I liked the story actually depicted what happened to the protogen scientists after their capture by the OPA, most of the present day stuff in this short just wasn't interesting to me. Cortazar's flashbacks to his life on Earth and his employment by Protogen were much more engaging. And that said, Cortazar didn't really need this tragic backstory. The situation of the Protogen scientists was heartbreaking enough as it was presented in Leviathan Wakes. All this added detail just didn't feel necessary to me. It was fine, I'm never going to read it again, but it's more Expanse, so if that's your thing, go nuts, and I'm giving The Vital Abyss a C. Hey everyone, I just read Cibola Burn by James S.A. Corey, and I'm still not sure how to pronounce the title. Is it Cibola or Cibola? I don't know. It's a book about the conflict between a group of refugee settlers and corporation-backed colonists on the first extrasolar system planet, and the crew of the Rocinante who are sent in to mediate the issue. I'm sure this'll end well. The pros? Mercury was another compelling antagonist. It was interesting to see him from the different viewpoints, how he was usually confrontational with Holden and the Belters, but supportive and protective of the people loyal to him like Havelock, a vile man but a fascinating character. I really liked how the book examined the dangers of biospheres from different planets interacting in unexpected ways. I feel like a lot of science fiction focuses on the big alien monsters, so it was nice to see a work give a little love to the more unassuming extraterrestrials, like instant death slugs. And the big scale alien stuff was a lot of fun, as usual. The mystery of the ring builders and their murderers kept me going for a lot of this book, which brings me to the cons. This was probably the weakest roster of viewpoint characters so far. I liked how Bezier and Havelock were both minor characters from earlier books, but I didn't find them all that interesting, and Elvy's fangirling over Holden just went on for way too long. It says a lot that the prologue and epilogue characters left more of an impact with me than most of the POVs I spent most of the book with. Just like Caliban's War was a bit of a rehash of Leviathan Wakes, this book feels like a bit of a repeat of Abaddon's Gate, just on a planet instead of in the slow zone. Both stories are about the crew of the Rocinante trying to stop ancient half-broken alien defense systems from killing all the humans in a place beyond the solar system. The pacing of both stories is very similar. The antagonists of both stories may be characterized very differently, but they do a lot of the same things. It was just very noticeable reading them back to back. And Ilus was kind of boring for an alien planet from the other side of the galaxy. I understand it being Earth-like was the point, and there are parts of it that were quite interesting, like the aforementioned instant death slugs, but a planet covered with ancient alien ruins is nothing we haven't seen before. I understand why this book needs to be here. It's a lot of setup for later entries that can't really be skipped over, and the last chance to resolve stuff that isn't needed for the story going forward, but overall I didn't find it as engaging as the previous 3 books. It's a bit of a mid-series slump in my opinion, so I'd only recommend it if you're already invested in the series, but that doesn't mean it's bad, and I'm giving Cibola Burn a B. Hey everyone, I just read Nemesis Games by James S. A. Corey, and it was great. This was the furthest I got the first time I read through the series, since it was the last one out at the time, and I wanted to wait until it was finished completely before I went through them all again, so from here on out, I'm going in blind. It's a book about the crew of the Rocinante going their separate ways across the solar system after their return from Ilus, to deal with personal histories that are rushing in to catch up with them, while new threats loom on the horizon as a result of the land grab created by the alien ring network humanity has unwittingly inherited. The pros? I loved how this book was able to balance 4 very personal, inward-looking stories with one very large solar system spanning plot. It was expertly done, starting off fairly low energy before ramping up to some of the biggest moments in the series. It hit all the right beats at the right times, and never really stumbled. At no point did it feel contrived that so many things ended up connected. I loved having the whole crew of the Rocinante as viewpoint characters this time around. It was great to see a more personal side to each of them that Holden and the reader usually aren't privy to. I especially enjoyed how each of them have things in their past that they regret, and each of them are at different stages of having forgiven themselves for those things. And there have been some major events depicted in the series so far, but this book presents a turning point. Things happen that make the status quo achieved in the first 4 books impossible to maintain, and I love that the authors took the risk to shake things up so drastically in such an earth-shattering way. The cons? As well as the book's focus on the crew of the Rocinante worked, this plot felt way too big to be told by only 4 characters, and I think some of the story got a little lost as a result. Not much though. The book took a very understated approach to a couple of its bigger moments, which is fine, and I'm not denying how hard it would be to actually depict some of them without the viewpoint characters dying in the process. But sometimes it felt to me that by understating what had happened, it was pushing these events into the background. But whatever, it's a nitpick. And if I had to pick a weakest plot thread, once again it would probably be Holden's. It wasn't bad by any means, it just didn't reach the heights of Naomi's, Alex's, or Amos's stories, but once again, this is a nitpick. This was a great read, I really enjoyed it. It has all of the series' best strengths and practically none of its weaknesses. It's hard to recommend on its own given it is the halfway point of an entire series, but maybe it's not a bad jumping on point if you're on the fence about committing to the books. There is some context from earlier entries that is required to fully enjoy it, but it's such a good read I'd almost suggest you give it a go anyway if you're a fan of science fiction and haven't already. And I'm giving Nemesis Games a well-earned S. Hey everyone, I just read Babylon's Ashes by James S. A. Corey, and it was good, but it wasn't what I wanted. Giving myself 7 years to imagine everything this book could never be will do that, I guess. It's a book about an all-out solar system spanning war between an alliance of the badly battered Earth, Mars, and the Outer Planets Alliance, and the latter's powerful splinter group, the Free Navy. The pros? This book sheds the limit on point of view characters adhered to by previous entries, and the cavalcade of new and returning viewpoints was really great. You get a much better sense of the war this way, and a better sense of how fractured the OPA has always been behind the scenes. Speaking of which, there were some fantastic battle sequences featured here, my personal favourite being the first one narrated by Bobby. And Marco is another great villain. He was very good in Nemesis Games, but he really comes into his own here as a character. He is a truly vile man who is very easy to hate. The cons? Good as the unlimited number of viewpoint characters is, it also presents its own problems. Some characters are quite prominent early on, but just vanish abruptly after a certain point. Other characters only get a single chapter that feel like they're setting up things for later in the book, but actually aren't. Some POVs felt a little superfluous, while some secondary characters felt like they should be points of view, but aren't. It was always going to be hard to balance, but I think it's just a little bit off. The focus of the book is on the war, which makes sense, and I don't really have a problem with that, but it does come at the expense of plot threads set up in Nemesis Games that never really come to anything or are pushed into the background here. The situations on Mars and Laconia, for example. And this last con is entirely a nitpick on my part, but I was expecting more of a body count and more of a war from this one. Not to say the way the book handles the conflict isn't interesting or even unrealistic in concept, but after how explosively it began in Nemesis Games, here things slow down early on and only really ramp up again toward the end. For many years I've always envisioned this book starting with the tension at 100 and staying there the whole way, but again, that's on me. Overall, I would be lying if I said this is exactly the book I wanted it to be, but it's true to itself and it's still good. I don't think it quite reaches the heights of Nemesis Games, but it is a satisfying conclusion to the plot started in that entry. This deep into the series, I can't really recommend it on its own, and I'm giving Babylon's Ashes an A. Hey everyone, I just read Strange Dogs, the 6th story collected in Memories Legion, and I didn't really care for it, to be honest. It just felt like a science fiction take on Pet Sematary. It's a novella about a young girl living with her family on Laconia around the same time that Winston Duarte and his separatist Martians arrive, and the tragedy that befalls her. The prose? The character work was very good. Kara felt like a real person, her family felt like real people. That was the best part of it for me. It was cool to see Laconia in its infancy before it grows into the galactic superpower that it is in the final 3 books of the series. And the horror elements were pretty effective once they showed up toward the end. The cons? I just don't feel like this story needed to be told. It doesn't really add anything to Kara and Zahn. I feel like their characterization in the last 2 books was enough, and nothing elaborated upon here added anything to them really. I don't know why, but Santiago Singh's cameo in this story bothered me. It's a complete nitpick on my part given how small the population on Laconia is at that point, but it still rubs me the wrong way that he and Zahn are friends here. I don't know why. And there's just nothing exciting about this story. You know exactly where it's going from the very first page, especially if you've already read the main books. I just couldn't get into it. Like so many of these Expanse shorts, it's not badly written, but it's just not interesting. If you're a super fan of the series, sure, give it a read, but it didn't really do anything for me. And I'm giving Strange Dogs a C. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read Persepolis Rising by James S.A. Corey, and it was great, but it's not without its problems. It's a book about humanity 30 years after the events of Babylon's Ashes. Earth and Mars are no longer the centre of the universe, the trade union oversees the 1300 colonies beyond the alien ring gates, even the crew of the Rocinante are growing old enough to be thinking of retirement, and then Laconia invades! Oh no! The pros? The way this series has set events up so that it can have an alien invasion where the aliens are also humans was great. It was fantastic to finally get a better look at Laconia, and the time skip between books has made them just strange enough to feel genuinely other without losing their humanity entirely. It was very well done. Speaking of which, I really enjoyed the 30-year time skip between books. I do have a couple of problems with it which I'll get into in the cons, but it did a good job of establishing the new normal hinted at in Babylon's Ashes without dragging the reader through all the growing pains. Much like with the book's handling of Laconia, things are familiar enough that the setting is still recognisably the same one as in the first half of the series, but different enough to show a lot of progress has been made since then. And this was another book that, pacing and plot-wise, was just excellently crafted. I loved how the drama on Freehold tied into the Laconian invasion later on. It was really well done. The cons? Much as I enjoyed the time skip, it does feel like the series glosses over a couple of big moments as a result. For example, Michio Parr's term as president of the trade union, which felt like it was being set up as a major plot point in the previous novel, or the newer members of the Rocinante's crew growing to be a part of that family and working through all the things that happened before they joined. Otherwise, it feels like moments that should be huge, like Avasarala coming out of retirement when Laconia invades, don't have as much of an impact because for the reader she never did retire. For us, things haven't changed. I know the authors were planning another trilogy between Babylon's Ashes and Persepolis Rising, and given how little has changed between those two books character-wise, I'm kind of glad they decided to skip them and jump straight to the Laconian invasion here, but there are a few things that feel like they got left behind as a result. I didn't really enjoy the interpersonal conflict between the crew of the Rocinante here. It just felt a little bit out of character for them, though I understand its function and it was nowhere near as bad as it was in the first season of the TV show. And though I really liked Singh as a character and his arc across the novel overall, his final chapter just felt a little abrupt. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Overall, this was another great read. I really enjoyed it, but like with Babylon's Ashes, I can't really recommend it as a standalone this deep into the series. But it is worth reading the other books to reach, and I'm giving Persepolis Rising an S. Hey everyone, I just read Auberon, the 7th story collected in Memories Legion, and it was okay, but it didn't really grab me. It's a novella about the colony world of Auberon in the wake of Laconia's sudden conquest of human space, and the way the two powers come to blows. The pros: it was great to see Eric come back for one last story and get some closure on him as a character. I really enjoyed how strange Auberon is as a planet, how each day only lasts around 4 hours, how everything stinks of poop. It was an interesting and far less glamorous take on the usual extrasolar colony. And it was great to learn what happened to Overstreet after the events of Persepolis Rising. The cons: this is another very literary story. The science fiction side of things are on the back burner, and that's fine, but it wasn't for me. I don't really feel like this story adds anything to the series overall. Yeah, it's nice to see Eric and Overstreet again, but they weren't exactly necessary endings to depict. I can think of a dozen other characters I would have preferred to get resolutions on. And I know I'm a broken record about this, but like with so many of these shorts, it just didn't grab me. There was no hook. It was fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it didn't do anything for me. And I'm giving Auberon a C. Hey everyone, I just read Tiamat's Wrath by James S.A. Corey, and it was great. Also, yes, that is Rain you hear in the background. Hang on. Space Marines with blue armor, an eagle motif, an immortal god emperor, a space outside of space filled with invincible monsters? Is this Warhammer 40,000? It's a book about humanity 5 years after the events of Persepolis Rising. Laconia is the centre of the universe, the trade union has no authority over the 1300 colonies beyond the alien ring gates. Even the crew of the Rocinante is scattered across human space as they fight an uphill battle against their oppressors as part of the underground. And then the things that killed the ring builders wake up. Oh no! The pros: I really enjoyed the POV characters in this one. Teresa was a great look into life on Laconia. Elvie is much more focused and engaging a character than she was back in Cibola Burn. I really enjoyed that the authors took the risk of relegating Holden to the prologue and epilogue point of views. It was a lot of fun. I loved the intrigue running through this whole story. Not just the big conflict of the ring builders and their killers suddenly ramping back up with humanity caught in the crossfire, but the political intrigue in Laconia between all the different factions and how it all comes to a head during the climax. It was really well paced and really well executed. And this book has the best set piece in the entire series in my opinion. The early books often struggled with portraying the sheer scale of space combat in terms of space and time, I felt, but the final battle here found the perfect balance of keeping the tension high while making clear the length and scope of the fight, to say nothing of how cathartic it was. The cons: Amos's plotline in this book felt a little like it was just hitting the beats it needed to without putting in the usual amount of depth each character normally gets. Not to say that it was bad, but it reminded me of early on in the series where things would happen for the convenience of the narrative rather than developing naturally through the telling of the tale. This is another nitpick from previous books, but some massive things happen in this novel, and most of them are described either second-hand or rather obliquely, and I just would have liked to have had those events depicted in a little more detail. And once again, I really did not enjoy the interpersonal conflict between the crew of the Rocinante, but again, it's a nitpick. This was a great read, a satisfying conclusion to a lot of the human plots going all the way back to the start of the series, that provides a good springboard for the final entry to launch off. I just hope they can stick the landing. It's the second last book in the series. There's too much context required for me to recommend reading it on its own, but I genuinely think it is worth reading the entire series to experience, and I'm giving Tiamat's Wrath an S. Hey everyone, I just read Leviathan Falls by James S.A. Corey, and say what you will, at least they got to the ending. Weird to think this is the first long-running series I've covered that has actually concluded. It's a book about humanity at war with itself, with Laconia's fractured empire struggling to maintain control, while the underground works to throw off their shackles, and a select few, including the equally fractured crew of the Rocinante, working to keep an even greater threat from wiping out all human life before the outcome of the war can even be decided. The pros? It was great to finally get definitive answers about the setting's mysterious extraterrestrials. They were satisfying, they were captivating, and more than anything they were suitably alien. I've always found that massive long-running stories like this work best when, no matter what happens in between, the conflict at the end of the series is the same at its core as the conflict at the beginning, and this book did that very well in many ways, even right down to the title. And I'm generally not a fan of new major characters coming into the plot right at the end of a story, be they heroes or villains, but Tanaka was so much fun that she managed to be the exception, even if it was only her characterization that got her across that line, rather than her function in the story. The cons? I suppose it's only appropriate given this book is a reflection of the early series, but there was some really clunky pacing here. Like in the earlier entries, it felt like things were happening for the sake of getting the plot to where it needed to be for something else, rather than things were happening naturally. For example, the events at the school, and pretty much everything in Freehold. The villain's big final plot doesn't come out of nowhere, it was adequately set up across the whole series, but that doesn't make it any less silly to me. I do think the authors handled it in the absolute best way possible. There's just something inherently a bit ridiculous about it that I couldn't take seriously, sorry. And this book ends very abruptly once the major conflict is resolved. Not to say that was a bad thing, I actually really enjoyed the epilogue, but given this is the last time we'll be in this universe, in this context, with these characters, I would have liked to have seen a bit more resolution for the secondary plot threads built up across the series, but this is mostly a nitpick. Endings are hard, and overall I think the authors stuck the landing, but the book definitely wasn't without its problems for me. Given this is the last book in the series, I can't recommend it on its own, but if you enjoyed the other 8, go for it, you owe it to yourself. And I'm giving Leviathan Falls an A. Hey everyone, I just read The Sins of Our Fathers, the 8th and final story collected in Memories Legion, and it was a satisfying coda to the series. Yeah, I know, bet you thought I was gonna hate it, eh? It's a novella about Philip Nagata just trying to survive in a post-Leviathan Falls universe, and the way his past keeps coming back to haunt him. The pros? I love the setting of this one, both the planet where Philip and his fellow colonists find themselves stranded, and the point in time in the series where it takes place. It absolutely reaches its fullest potential. I love the tone of it too. This was fantastic cosmic horror in a very understated way, and I love Philip as a character here, how he's changed since we last saw him in Babylon's Ashes, how he interacts with fellow returning character Nami Volovodov, how he doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes of his past, and the lengths he goes to in order to make sure they don't. It was fantastic. The cons? I honestly kind of want more. There's so much potential here for more stories. I feel a little disappointed we don't get to see more of the struggles on Janna. Because this is a novella, a lot of events and character stuff is condensed, and I would have liked to have seen everything fleshed out a bit more. And like the main books, it ends very abruptly. Those problems aside, I love this one. It was a great story to end on, and I'd easily recommend it to fans because the series doesn't feel complete without it. And I'm giving The Sins of Our Fathers an A. Hey everyone, I just read Memories Legion by James S.A. Corey, and reading this book was honestly like pulling teeth. Have I mentioned I do not like short stories? At all? It's a collection of short stories about the universe of the Expanse, detailing the backstories of the setting and the characters in the little moments of their lives before and after the whole universe went crazy with the arrival of the proto-molecule. The pros? It was great to get a glimpse at the setting from before and around the early books in the series. It was nice to return to that more familiar speculative future when it was just Earth, Mars and the Belt as the major players in the universe. The Churn was an absolute highlight, not just because it was a great story in and of itself, but because it was refreshing to have an omniscient third-person narrator after an entire series of having each chapter be a close focus on a specific point of view character. And Sins of Our Fathers was a great coda for the series overall, not just because it brought back a couple of characters who were suspiciously absent after Babylon's Ashes, but because it was great to see the aftermath of Leviathan Falls depicted on the page rather than through implication. The cons? So many of these stories were just so unnecessary. I don't feel like my understanding of the setting or the characters was improved or enhanced for having read most of them. Similarly, a lot of these stories are very literary. There are still science fiction aspects to them all, but most of them are more devoted to creating realistic characters, which was fine and interesting in its own way, but I did not enjoy the blending of these two genres. And aside from the couple of stories I mentioned earlier, none of them really grabbed me the way the main books did. Very few of them have an immediate hook. I really did not enjoy this collection. Maybe there's something here if you really love the series, and definitely read the Churn at the very least. But otherwise I think you can give it a pass. And I'm giving Memories Legion a C. Sorry. And since we're here, one more for the road. Hey everyone, I just read the Expanse series by James S. A. Corey, also known as Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank, and it was really good. I completely understand why so many people love it. It's a series about the human race and the changes it goes through across several decades after the discovery and exploitation of a mysterious weapon created by a long-dead alien civilization. The pros? The scope and scale of this story is fantastic. The setting goes through some major changes over the course of the series and none of it felt forced. It was all very natural, and even at the end I could feel the echoes of the universe as it was at the beginning of the books, shining through the places and the people. The characters were fantastic, especially the viewpoints. I think it really helped having two authors because it gave the series two different lenses through which to view the same events and scatter that light into many different perspectives. Not all of them were winners and not all of them changed all that much over the course of the story, but they were all very well realised. And the way the story of this series overall was put together was really good. It was wonderfully constructed. The cons? The series definitely suffers from a few teething problems early on with pacing and narrative contrivance. It does get much better after a certain point, but it does make the first trilogy or so a bit rough to read. The series did a pretty good job of fleshing out and giving focus to each of the factions, except for Mars in my opinion, which is crazy given how important it is to the plot. It has the fewest viewpoint characters and the least amount of presence despite its aforementioned importance, and I kind of wish it had been given a bit more love outside of the short stories. And I found most of the short fiction to be pretty boring overall. Minor issues aside, this series was great. I'd easily recommend it to any fans of science fiction who haven't given it a go already. And I'm giving The Expanse an A. And that's it. Here are all the stories ranked. I'm really glad to have finally read this series all the way through. The second half surprised me in a lot of good ways, and honestly it's just nice to read something with an actual ending for a change. I'm always looking for reading suggestions, so if there's something you'd like me to check out, post it down in the comments and I'll add it to the pile. I'll get to it eventually. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like, subscribe, share the video around. If you like unnecessarily long gaming critiques, why not check out my other channel? The link is in the description. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye everyone.